Hello friends, welcome back to my channel Tech Explorer. I hope you all are doing well in this pandemic situation. Do take care of yourself and your family. So by now, I hope you understood the concept of chatbots and got a clear picture of how to build one from my earlier videos. And I'm expecting that you must have started creating your own one. If you haven't gone through my videos, then do go through them. I have shared the link in the description box below. So today we will be implementing our own custom actions using Rasa open source. So let's start. What we are going to learn in this session, we are going to see the different types of actions, what are responses, what are custom actions, we are going to see forms and details, and then we are going to see default actions. So let's see what are actions for a Rasa chatbot. After each input message that is given by the user, your chatbot identifies the intent and then predicts an action that the bot should perform the next. What is a Rasa action server? A Rasa action server runs the custom actions that a Rasa open source conversational bot will perform. When your chatbot predicts a custom action, the Rasa server sends a post request to the action server with the JSON payload. That includes the name of the predicted action, the conversation ID, the contents of the tracker, and the contents of the domain. When the action server finishes running a custom action, it returns a JSON payload of responses and events. The Rasa server then returns to the user and adds the events to the conversation tracker. So today we are going to see how to implement the actions in Rasa in detail. Now, what are responses? Responses are simply the messages that your chatbot sends to the user. Responses are usually text messages, but they can also include images and buttons. You can specify all the responses either under the response keyword in the domain file, or you can create a separate responses.yml file. And each response name should start with an utter keyword, like utter_greet, utter_by, etc. You can see in this example. Now let's see what are variables and how to use them in responses. Variables can be used to insert the information into responses. Variables are enclosed in curly brackets within a response. You can see through this example. The response name is utter_greet and the text message which we have given here, hey name, how are you? Name is the variable through which we will insert the information. So when the utter_greet response is called, the Rasa fills the variable with a value that it finds in the slot called name. If the slot doesn't exist or is empty, then variable gets filled with none value. Now, variations in your responses. If you want your chatbot to reply in a more interesting manner, then you can provide multiple response variations to choose from for a given response name. So here in this example, response utter_greet, you have provided two text messages. So when your bot predicts utter_greet as the next action to perform, Rasa will randomly pick one of the two response variations to use. Now, what are channel-specific response variations? Channel-specific response variations are used to specify the variety of responses depending on which channel the user is connected to. Here you can see in this example, response utter_ask_game, we have provided two text messages. One text message with channel specified as Slack. The channel keyword makes the first response variation channel-specific for the Slack channel, while the second variation is not channel-specific. Make sure the value of the channel key matches the value returned by the name method of your input channel. If you are using a built-in channel, this value will also match the channel name used in your credentials.yml file. When your bot looks for a suitable response variation under a given response name, it will first try to choose from the channel-specific variations for the current channel. If there are no such variations, the bot will choose from any response variations which are not channel-specific. So in the above example, the second response variation has no channel specified and can be used by your bot for all the channels other than Slack. For each response, try to have at least one response variation without the channel key. This allows your assistant to properly respond in all the environments, such as in new channels, in the shell, and in the interactive learning. Now let's see how you can make your responses rich. You can make your responses rich by adding visual and interactive elements. Example buttons, images. So here is an example of a response that uses buttons. Each button in the list of buttons should have two keys. First is the title. This gives the text to be displayed on the buttons that the user sees. And the second is the payload, the message sent from the user to the bot when the button is clicked. You can also use images in your responses. You can add the images to a response by providing a URL to the image under the image key. Now let's see how we can use responses in conversations. First, let's see calling the responses as actions. So in the domain file in this example, you can see you have used a response named utter greet. So if the name of the response starts with utter keyword, the response can directly be used as an action without being listed in the actions section of your domain. You would add the response to the domain under the response key, and same can be used directly in your stories. When the utter greet action runs, it will send the message from the response back to the user. Note one thing. If you want to change the text or any other part of the response, you need to retrain the assistant before these changes will be picked up. Now calling responses from custom action. You can use the responses to generate the response messages from your custom actions. If you are using Rasa SDK as your action server, you can use the dispatcher to generate the response message. Now let's see what are custom actions. Custom actions can run any code we want, which can include the API calls, database queries, and many more. They can do anything from adding events to a calendar to checking balance of user's bank account to anything we can imagine. To implement a custom action, create a child class of action class and define two functions. One is name and another is run. The name function will return the name of the action, and the run function will define the functionality the action has to perform when it is called. So what happens when Dialog Engine predicts a custom action? When the Dialog Engine predicts a custom action to be executed, it will call the action server with the following information. And then the action server will respond with a list of events and responses. Now let's see forms in details. One of the most common conversation patterns is to collect a few pieces of information from the user in order to do something, like book a restaurant, call an API, search a database, etc. This is also called slot filling. Now, how to use a form? To use forms with Rasa open source, you need to make sure that the rule policy is added to your policy configuration. Now, to define a form, define it by adding it to the forms section in your domain. The name of the form is also the name of the action which you can use in stories or rules to handle form execution. You also need to define the slot mappings for each slot which your form should fill. You can specify one or more slot mappings for each slot to be filled. The following example, form restaurant form, will fill the slot cuisine from an extracted entity cuisine and slot num people from the entity number. Once the form action gets called for the first time, the form gets activated and will prompt the user for the next required slot value. To activate a form, you need to add a story or rule, which describes when your bot runs the form, and a form will automatically deactivate itself once all required slots are filled. Now we come to slot mappings. Rasa open source comes with 4 predefined mappings to fill the slots of a form based on the latest user message. The from entity, from text, from intent, and from trigger intent. The from entity mapping fills the slots based on extracted entities. It will look for an entity called entity name to fill a slot called slot name. If intent name is none, the slot will be filled regardless of intent name. Otherwise, the slot will only be filled if the user's intent is intent name. If role name or group name are provided, the role or the group label of the entity also needs to match the given values. The slot mapping will not apply if the intent of the message is excluded even. Intent. The from text mapping will use the text of the next user utterance to fill the slot name. If the intent name is none, the slot will be filled regardless of intent name. Otherwise, the slot will only be filled if the user's intent is intent name. The from intent mapping will fill the slot name with value my value if user intent is intent name or none. The slot mapping will not apply if the intent of the message is excluded intent. And finally, the from trigger intent mapping will fill slot called slot name with value my value if the form was activated by a user message with intent called intent name. Now, what are default actions? Default actions are actions that are built into the dialog manager by default. Most of these are automatically predicted based on certain conversation situations. You may want to customize these to personalize your assistant. Each of these actions, they have a default behavior. In order to override this default behavior, you have to write a custom action whose name method will return the same name as the default action. And then you have to add this action to the action section of your domain file so that your bot knows to use the custom definition instead of your default one. And note one thing, after adding this action to your domain file, you have to retrain your model. Otherwise, Rasa won't know that you have made some certain changes and may skip the retraining or dialog modeling. Here are examples of certain default actions. The action listen. The action is predicted to signal that the assistant should do nothing and wait for the next user input. The action restart resets the whole conversation history, including any slots that were set during it. The action session starts a new conversation session and is executed in the various situations like at the beginning of each new conversation or after a user was inactive for a period defined by the session expiration time parameter in the domain's session configuration, or when a user sends a session start message during conversation. The action will reset the conversation tracker, but by default will not clear any slots that were set. The action default fallback undoes the last user bot interaction and sends the utter default response if it is defined. It is triggered by low action prediction confidence and if you have this fallback mechanism enabled. The action deactivate loop deactivates the active loop and resets the requested slot. This is used when handling unhappy paths in the forms. The action revert fallback events action is deprecated since the 2.0 release. The action two-stage fallback has now handled all the two-stage fallback behavior. And the action two-stage fallback is a fallback loop that can be used to handle low NLU confidence. The action default ask affirmation is used by the action two-stage fallback loop. It asks the user to confirm the intent of their message. This action can be customized to be more personalized to your specific use case. Then we come to action default ask rephrase. This action is used by the action two-stage fallback loop if the user denies the intent action default ask affirmation displays. It asks the user to rephrase their message. Then finally, action back. This action undoes the last user bot interaction. It can be triggered by the user by sending a back message to the bot if the rule policy is configured. So these were some of the default actions and the small explanations. I hope you enjoyed the video and got a pretty much clear understanding of actions of Rasa open source and how to implement them. Now, I think you are capable of creating your own bot. I hope by now you can make your bot perform various actions as per your own innovative mind. If you haven't gone through my earlier videos, do go through my earlier videos to know what is a chatbot, their various concepts, and how to create one using Rasa. I will be sharing the links in my description box. So if you like my channel, do subscribe it. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.